Hello again, everyone. Again, I'm Rick Bedlack from Duke, and I'm going to give you some background on why I thought we needed this program and how it's evolved over the years. Before I start, I just wanted to show you some of my disclosures. I do have research support from the ALS Association, the Healy Center, and Medicine Nova. And I also consult for several people, the ALS Association, Alexion, Amylyx, Biogen, Biohaven, Brainstorm, ITF Pharma, Mallinckrodt, Orphazyme, and Woolsey. Mainly, I'm on their data safety monitoring boards and trying to help them design more patient-centric research protocols. So I saw my first person affected by ALS in the late 90s when I was a resident at Duke. And you can tell that this picture comes from that era for two reasons. First, it's the only time I ever wore blue blazers. You know, I just got into Duke and it was a big place and pretty conservative, and I wanted to lay low until I figured it out. And the other is the hair. That's the Jerry Seinfeld hairstyle from the late 90s. But I'll never forget that patient. I'll never forget how amazed I was by their story and by the collection of physical findings that they had. And I'll never forget how horrified I was when the attending that I was learning from came in and said, you know, we know what this is called, but we don't really know why it happens, and there's not much we can do about it. You just have to go home and get your affairs in order. And I remember driving home that day and thinking this was the disease I wanted to focus on. I decided to stay at Duke and try to build a new program that would offer people options, clinical options, and a research program that would offer them some hope. And so about 10 years in, I kind of looked back over what I'd accomplished, and I was pretty proud of it. I built a very large multidisciplinary ALS clinic, and they're all, you know, fun, energetic, hopeful people. They indulge my crazy fashions. In fact, sometimes they even dress in the same theme as me, as you can see in this picture. I've got a second neurologist, multiple speech therapists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, respiratory therapist, a pulmonologist, a nutritionist, a rehab engineer, a social worker, a coordinator, and now 2 research nurses. And I was able to build research into this. So by collaborating with people all over the world, we were able to offer genetic studies, biomarker studies, and lots of different clinical trials. And we kind of changed the culture at Duke. We made it a destination where people from all over wanted to come. We now see about 250 new people with ALS a year, and we follow about 450 at any given time. And I thought that was about as good as anybody could do. And then I noticed something curious. Only a very small percentage of the people that I was following were actually participating in the research that I offered. And as I looked around at other clinics, it was the same. I found that somewhere between 2 and 10% of the people with ALS in clinics around the United States were participating in research. Look at it in a different way. We did something called the trial enrollment rate, the number of people who enroll per site per month in a clinical trial. And so most of us now see, you know, between 60 and 80 patients in a month. And on average, if you look at published trials, 2 patients per site per month enroll. And the other thing was, back when I looked at this around 2008, this really wasn't changing much over time. We had about 40 years worth of clinical trials, and the enrollment rate was about the same. So to me, this was really important because first of all, it meant that people were being deprived of the benefits of being in trials, and there's lots of benefits. Obviously, there's the possibility of getting something that might help. There's the hope and altruism that go along with participating in a clinical trial. And interestingly, many different diseases have shown that people who participate in clinical trials do better medically than people who do not, regardless of whether they get the real drug or the placebo. And I'm sure you could figure out why. I mean, the hope and the altruism probably matter in terms of how people do. But if you've been in a research study, you know that we see people much more often and we measure a lot more things. And so if something is going wrong medically, we're much more likely to find it quickly in a clinical trial. Poor enrollment also means that trials take longer. They cost more. There are examples of clinical trials, even in the ALS field, that have been terminated without a definitive conclusion because of poor enrollment. And finally, you know, if we complete a clinical trial and it works, well, if only 10% of all eligible people might have participated, how do we know that this thing works in anybody else? How do we know that it works for all the people who didn't participate? The bottom line is, until we could solve this enrollment problem, it's going to take us longer to find a cure for ALS than it should. And that's not acceptable to any of us. And so the first thing I had to do was understand why this was happening. And I tried to do that by studying what was going on in other fields that had the same problem, and by doing my own surveys, which I've published in a couple of papers. Surveys of clinicians who were offering trials and surveys of people living with ALS. And what I found was, first of all, there just weren't enough options. You know, even today, if you look at all the spots for all the open clinical trials in the United States, it's probably somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 spots. And we think there's between 20 and 30,000 people living with ALS in the United States. So there's not nearly enough spots. But another problem was that people with ALS felt disconnected. So many of them were unaware of their research options. Their doctors weren't telling them, keeping them informed about studies. Many of them had misconceptions about research options. So for example, we had questions about a biomarker study, and many patients thought, well, you know, I've already donated blood for another biomarker study, so just use some of that blood for your study. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. I found that many people didn't appreciate the kinds of models we were basing our studies on, didn't appreciate the small effect sizes that we were looking for. Many of our trials were very restrictive in terms of who could be in. So most of the patients in my clinic would have been excluded even if they wanted to participate. Many of the trials that we were doing were using placebos, which are not acceptable to some patients. Many had lots of in-person visits, and that can be difficult. You know, many of my patients live far from my clinic. Asking them to come in every month or even more often for an in-person visit is a lot. And many people didn't appreciate the long time that it takes to get results. In some cases, it can be years, 2, 3, even 4 years between when the first person in a trial enrolls and when the results become available to everyone. And as a result of these frustrations, many people who might have been eligible for research study were self-experimenting with alternative and off-label treatments, things like curcumin and coconut oil. And they were frustrated that doctors were not more interested in these kinds of products. And so the next thing I did is I looked around to see what my colleagues in other fields were doing about some of these problems. And I really liked what my Parkinson's disease colleagues were doing. They had created something called clinical research learning institutes. So these were crash courses for patients and families who wanted to learn more about research and wanted to find out all the different places that they might be able to influence it. And so they typically took place over 3 days, and there were a series of specific classes. And then afterward, they held regular meetings with the people who graduated from these classes, which they called research advocates. And in those meetings, they found specific ways to connect them with some of the things that were going on in their community. And so they found ways to connect their research advocates, the sponsors, to help them develop studies that had maybe more relevant questions. They found ways to connect them with fundraisers so that they could raise more money to do more research. They found ways to connect them with studies that were open to help the sponsors maybe advertise the studies better. They found ways to help their research advocates analyze and interpret results so that the message that was crafted at the end of the study might be more understandable to everyone in the community. And finally, they found ways to get their research advocates involved with policymakers like the FDA to help them understand things from a patient perspective. And so that motivated me to try to create ALS Clinical Research Learning Institutes. And as you know by now, we've been successful in creating these. This is number 19. So most of these have taken place in person in Clearwater, Florida. And that was a picture of the last in-person class that we had. But recently we've learned that we can do these pretty well on the internet. Terry has sponsored several of them, either on the internet or in person in Philadelphia. We've also had one in Sacramento, one in Phoenix, and one in St. Louis. And through these programs, we've now trained more than 400 patients and family members. And we call our graduates ALS Research Ambassadors. And the folks who've graduated from this program have taken it to levels that I never imagined. So they've been involved in fundraising. In fact, two of the people who attended one of my first clinical research learning institutes were Pat Quinn and Pete Frates. And you may remember they went on after that to start the Ice Bucket Challenge, which raised over $200 million in just 3 months. And that money went on to fund a large number of exciting new research studies that helped us to find new causes of ALS, new genes, for example. And that money actually helped to fund the AMX 0035 clinical trial, which looks very promising. Some of our research ambassadors have interacted with Congress. There's been more than 2,500 individual interactions with members of Congress. And through those, these folks have helped us to obtain and maintain funding for the National ALS Registry. They've helped us obtain and maintain funding for the DoD's ALS research program. And as you heard Michelle mention, they're currently working on some very exciting bills, which would not only fund more research, but also something called expanded access programs, which are desperately needed in ALS. And these are called the Promising Pathways Act and the Accelerating Access to Critical Therapies Act, which is also called ACT for ALS. These research ambassadors have helped us to understand how we can design more patient-centric studies. So they were invited to attend a big meeting of ALS researchers from all over the world in 2016. This was called the CRLI House meeting. And out of that meeting came a paper called the ALS Clinical Trial Guidelines. And there's a whole section in there about things that we think should be done to make research more patient-centric. They've been interacting with individual researchers who are designing protocols to help make those protocols more attractive and more patient-friendly. So for example, they've helped me to develop some protocols for my ROAR program, Replication of ALS Reversals program. They've even connected with sponsors, big pharma sponsors like Biohaven and MT Pharma, and helped them change some of the protocols they had envisioned to make those more successful. They've been spreading awareness too, awareness of the importance of participating in research in general, but also awareness about specific studies. They've given more than 1,000 speeches at support groups and fundraisers around the United States. They've given more than 400 interviews. They've posted things on blogs and on websites to help clear up some of the misconceptions that can permeate through these areas. They've advised us on better ways to advertise trials ourselves. So we have a new NEALS trials search engine. We have a person at NEALS, which is a trial concierge. So there's actually a person with a phone number and an email. If you're out there and you're trying to find a research study, and a lot of these search engines seem to be overwhelming, that person will help you. And there's a lot of just, real local grassroots efforts. So this is, one of my favorite quotes from one of our research ambassadors named Rick. I'm starting to see evidence that our efforts work. For the first time, our clinic is getting requests about clinical trials from patients. I'm speaking to support groups around our state, and it's piqued their interest. I'm working with our clinic to make myself available on clinic day to provide information and guidance with the trial process. So Rick was actually just showing up at his ALS clinic, even on days when he wasn't supposed to be seen there, and just sitting out in the lobby and helping patients and families to navigate the clinical research process. And as I said, they're clearing up misconceptions in chat rooms. They're teaching other patients about research terminology. They've been liaisoning with the FDA, and they participated in something called the ALS FDA Drug Development Guidance. And if you haven't seen this, I would encourage you to take a look at it. There's a lot of things in there that should expedite drug development and should make it more patient-centric. And now our challenge is to get the FDA to actually adhere to this document that's been put out. And they've been helping to educate me and many other patients and families around the world about some of these so-called AOTs. So I've got some research ambassadors participating in ALS Untangled and giving me feedback on how I can make it better. If you don't know what this is, it's a group that I started in 2009. It's now a team of over 130 clinicians and scientists from across 11 different countries that are working to specifically review AOTs suggested by patients and families. And our ultimate goal is to help people make more informed decisions about them. We know there's always going to be some people that are going to self-experiment, and we just want to make sure they understand the different options that are out there. And so a little bit about what you can expect from the faculty that are on this call. We're going to teach you about research, about the process of it, about how you can look critically at a scientific publication, about the ALS pipeline and why we're so excited about it right now, about some of the barriers that are out there to us being successful in terms of bringing these exciting products to you, and about where there are opportunities for us to work together to overcome these barriers through education and advocacy. We're also going to lead a monthly call, which is called the Peace Committee, Patient Education and Advocacy Committee. And you are all invited to participate in this with us. And on this call, we have various stakeholders in the ALS community who are going to present projects that they're working on where they want research ambassador input. And the faculty will also pledge to be available to you from now on to answer your questions about research, to give you suggestions about research, and to mentor you on some of the advocacy and education projects that you might decide to take on. We do expect some things out of you as well. You know, we're hoping that you'll be engaged throughout the program, and afterward, it's always a little bit harder to be engaged virtually. But you know, I already see people typing into the chat box, which is great, and we'll make sure we get to those questions at the end. There's a paper that we're going to take you through tomorrow, and it's so much more helpful if you read the paper ahead of time and try your best to critique it. I think you'll learn a lot more when you do that, and we show you how we critique it. There's going to be an evaluation at the end of each one of these talks and at the end of the whole program, and it's so helpful if you complete that evaluation. You know, this program today does not look a lot like the program that we first put together in 2011. We've changed it every single time in response to feedback from research ambassadors like you. It's much better now than it's ever been. We want you to embrace this title of research ambassador. And in that role, we want you to go out and educate and advocate to other patients and caregivers living with this disease and to decision makers. Help us design better trials. Help the FDA to understand what it means to be a patient with this disease and what your risk tolerance looks like. Come and join us on the Peace Committee meetings every month. And finally, on the NEALS website, we have something which is called the tracker. And we really want you to maintain this. You're going to be given keys to it when this is all over. Whenever you do something that's related to your role as a research ambassador, please go on to the tracker and tell us about it. Honestly, you know, this program, each time we put it together, we have to try to think about how to fund it. It's a lot less expensive to do it this way than it is in person, but it always costs something. And you know, when we're asking for money, the first thing that sponsors always ask is, well, can you show us any evidence that this thing works, that it does anything? And this tracker is a really important piece of arguing with them that this does actually move the needle. And so I think Terry's already gone over the agenda with you, so I'm not going to do that again. But I will stop here and take questions.